The Wyoming wind carried the scent of sage and impending rain as Sarah McKenna stood at the edge of her family's modest homestead, watching dark clouds gather over the Laramie Mountains. Her worn cotton dress fluttered against her legs, and she pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. At 19, she had already seen enough hardship to age her beyond her years, but her green eyes still held the fierce determination that ran in her Irish blood. "Sarah, come inside now," her mother's voice called from their small log cabin, tinged with the worry that had become constant these past months. "Your father needs to speak with you." Sarah's stomach tightened as she walked toward the house. The tension between their settlement and the Blackwood Ranch had been escalating for weeks. Cattle had been found grazing on planted fields, water rights were disputed, and tempers on both sides were reaching a dangerous breaking point. She had overheard enough hushed conversations between her parents to know that something significant was being decided. Inside, Patrick McKenna sat heavily at their rough-hewn table, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of chicory coffee. The lines on his face seemed deeper than usual, and his grey hair was disheveled as if he'd been running his fingers through it. Beside him, her mother Margaret stood with red-rimmed eyes, clutching a worn handkerchief. "Sit down, daughter," Patrick said quietly, his Irish accent still thick after 15 years in America. "We need to talk." Sarah lowered herself onto the wooden bench across from him, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind rattling the shutters and the distant lowing of their few remaining cattle. "The meeting with the other families didn't go well," her father began, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Blackwood's pushing harder than ever to run us out. His cattle destroyed the Morrisons' wheat crop last week, and young Tom Peters got into a fistfight with 3 of Blackwood's men near the creek. Blood was spilled." Margaret moved to stand behind her husband, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. "Tell her, Patrick. She has the right to know." Patrick's blue eyes met Sarah's, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Defeat mixed with desperate hope. "The elders have proposed a solution, Sarah. An old way of settling disputes that was common back in Ireland, and even here on the frontier in the early days." "What kind of solution?" Sarah asked, though a cold dread was already settling in her stomach. "A marriage alliance," her mother whispered, the words barely audible. "Between you and James Blackwood, the ranch owner's son. It would bind our families together, make us all kin. The fighting would have to stop." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. James Blackwood. She had seen him from a distance at the occasional town gatherings in Laramie. Tall, dark-haired, always dressed in fine clothes that spoke of wealth and privilege. He was handsome enough, she supposed, but he belonged to a world as foreign to her as the moon. "I don't understand," she said slowly, though part of her did understand all too well. "You want to trade me, like livestock." "Not trade," Patrick said firmly, leaning forward. "This would be a proper marriage, Sarah, with a ceremony and everything legal. James Blackwood would become your husband in the eyes of God and the law. You'd want for nothing. The Blackwoods are the wealthiest family in 3 counties. "But I don't know him," Sarah protested, her voice rising. "I don't love him. How can you ask me to marry a stranger?" Margaret moved around the table and knelt beside her daughter, taking Sarah's hands in her own work-roughened ones. "Love can grow, sweetheart. Your father and I, we barely knew each other when we wed back in County Cork, but look at us now, 30 years together, and we've built a life." "That was different," Sarah said, tears stinging her eyes. "You had a choice." "Did we?" Patrick asked quietly. "My family was starving, Sarah. Your mother's father needed the bride price to save his farm. We all make sacrifices for family. It's what holds us together when everything else falls apart." Sarah looked around their small cabin, taking in the patched curtains her mother had sewn from flour sacks, the few pieces of furniture her father had built with his own hands, the family Bible that had traveled across an ocean. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and now it was all at risk. "What if I refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Patrick's shoulders sagged. "Then we keep fighting, and eventually the Blackwoods will win. They have more men, more money, more influence with the territorial government. We'll lose everything, Sarah. Not just us, but the Morrisons, the Peters family, the O'Briens, everyone who's tried to make a life here." The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a heavy yoke. She thought of little Mary Morrison, barely 5 years old, and Tom Peters, who had just gotten engaged to sweet Lucy O'Brien. All their dreams, their futures, hanging in the balance. "When?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The wedding would be in 3 weeks, Margaret said gently. That gives us time to prepare, and it shows good faith to the Blackwoods. James has already agreed to the arrangement. Sarah nodded slowly, feeling as if she were floating outside her own body, watching someone else make this life-altering decision. 3 weeks, she repeated. That night, after her parents had gone to bed, Sarah stood again at the edge of their property, looking up at the star-filled Wyoming sky. The wind had died down and the silence was profound, the kind of deep quiet that only existed in wide-open spaces far from civilization. She thought about James Blackwood, trying to imagine what kind of man would agree to marry a stranger for the sake of ending a land dispute. Was he kind? Cruel? Did he see her as nothing more than a solution to a problem, or might he come to care for her as her mother hoped? A shooting star streaked across the darkness, and Sarah found herself making a wish, not for escape, which seemed impossible now, but for the strength to face whatever lay ahead with dignity and grace. Tomorrow her new life would begin, whether she was ready or not. 25 miles away at the sprawling Blackwood Ranch, James Blackwood stood in his father's study, staring at the marriage contract that lay open on the massive oak desk. The document was written in formal legal language, but its meaning was crystal clear. He would marry Sarah McKenna in 3 weeks' time, uniting the feuding families and ending the conflict that had consumed the territory for months. "You're awfully quiet, son," said Cornelius Blackwood from behind the desk. At 62, the ranch patriarch still cut an imposing figure, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, with steel-gray eyes that had seen the Wyoming territory transform from wilderness to civilization. Having second thoughts, James looked up from the contract, his dark eyes reflecting the light from the oil lamp. At 28, he had his father's height and strong jaw, but there was something gentler in his expression, a thoughtfulness that sometimes frustrated the older man. "I'm wondering if we're doing the right thing, forcing a young woman into marriage to solve our problems." Cornelius leaned back in his leather chair, studying his son with barely concealed impatience. "No one's forcing anything, James. The girl's family proposed this arrangement. They see the benefits as clearly as we do. Besides, you're not exactly a poor prospect. You're educated, wealthy, and you'll inherit one of the largest ranches in Wyoming territory. Most women would consider themselves fortunate. Most women would have a choice in the matter," James replied, moving to the window that overlooked the ranch's main courtyard. Even in the moonlight, he could see the extent of his family's holdings, the sprawling house, the numerous outbuildings, the corrals that held hundreds of horses. It was an empire built on ambition and hard work, but also on the understanding that power meant making difficult decisions. "Choice is a luxury, son. I didn't have a choice when I came here 30 years ago with nothing but the clothes on my back and a determination to build something lasting. Your mother didn't have a choice when she agreed to marry a rough frontiersman instead of the Boston gentleman her family preferred. We make the choices we can live with, and we make them work." James turned back to face his father, remembering his mother, Eleanor Blackwood, had died 5 years ago, but her influence still shaped the ranch and the man James had become. She had been a lady in the truest sense, bringing culture and refinement to the harsh frontier life, but she had also been practical enough to understand what survival required. "Tell me about the girl," James said, settling into the chair across from his father's desk. "Sarah McKenna. What do you know about her?" Cornelius shuffled through some papers, pulling out a brief report written in his foreman's careful handwriting. 19 years old, unmarried, father's Patrick McKenna. Came here from Ireland about 15 years ago, settled on a quarter section near Willow Creek. They've been struggling like most of the small farmers. She's educated. Apparently the local school teacher speaks highly of her. No history of trouble. Keeps to herself, mostly." "That's not what I meant," James said quietly. "What kind of person is she? What does she want from life?" His father's expression softened slightly. "I don't know, son. I suppose you'll have to find that out for yourself. But I will say this. The McKennas are good people. Hard-working, honest, the kind of neighbors you'd want if times were different. This marriage could be the beginning of something better for everyone involved." James picked up the contract again, reading through the provisions that would govern his future. The McKenna family would retain their land, but under Blackwood protection. Sarah would receive a generous settlement and allowance, as well as the security of the Blackwood name. In return, she would become his wife in every sense, expected to bear children and help him manage the social obligations that came with their position. "Have you considered what Mother would think of this arrangement?" James asked. Cornelius was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "Your mother understood duty, James. She also understood that love and respect can grow between two people who are committed to building a life together. She'd want you to be fair to the girl, to give her a chance to find happiness in this situation. And if she can't, if this marriage becomes a prison for both of us, then you'll have to work harder to make it something else," his father replied firmly. "The Blackwood name means something in this territory, son. It means we keep our word, we honor our commitments, and we take care of our own. That girl will become one of ours the moment she says, 'I do.'" James stood and walked to another window, this one facing east toward the McKenna homestead. He couldn't see their cabin from here. The distance was too great and the terrain too rolling, but he knew it was there, along with the young woman whose life was about to become inextricably linked with his. "I'll need to meet her before the wedding," he said finally. "Properly, I mean, not just a formal introduction at the altar." "Of course. I'll arrange something for next week. Perhaps she could come here for dinner, bring her parents, give you both a chance to get acquainted." James nodded, trying to imagine what that conversation would be like. What did you say to a woman who was marrying you out of necessity rather than affection? How did you begin to build a relationship under such circumstances? "There's something else, son," Cornelius said, his tone becoming more serious. "This marriage will make you responsible for more than just Sarah McKenna. The other families in that settlement will be looking to you for leadership, for protection. You'll need to be ready for that." "I understand," James replied, though the full weight of that responsibility was still sinking in. He had always known he would inherit the ranch someday, but he had imagined having more time to prepare, more freedom to choose his own path. As he left his father's study and walked through the quiet house toward his own room, James found himself thinking about the woman who would soon share his name. "Sarah McKenna." He repeated it silently, trying to make it feel real. In 3 weeks, she would be Sarah Blackwood, mistress of one of the largest ranches in Wyoming Territory. The thought should have filled him with satisfaction, or at least resignation. Instead, he felt a growing sense of responsibility that went far beyond the business arrangement outlined in the contract. Somewhere out there in the darkness, a young woman was probably lying awake, wondering what her future would hold. The least he could do was try to make it a good one. James paused at his bedroom door, looking back down the hallway toward his father's study. The older man was still there, going over ranch business by lamplight, planning and calculating as he had every night for decades. It was a lonely existence in many ways, but it was also purposeful, built on the understanding that individual desires sometimes had to be sacrificed for the greater good. Tomorrow, James would begin the process of getting to know his future bride. Tonight, he would try to imagine what kind of marriage they might build together. Not the passionate romance of novels, perhaps, but something based on mutual respect and shared commitment to the life they were choosing. It would have to be enough for both of them. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Blackwood Ranch's main yard as Sarah sat beside her mother in their borrowed wagon, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. She wore her best dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and her mother had spent an hour that morning braiding her auburn hair into an elaborate arrangement that felt foreign and uncomfortable. "Remember what we discussed," Margaret whispered as they approached the grand house. "Be polite, but don't be afraid to speak your mind. The Blackwoods need to see the woman you truly are." Sarah nodded, though her throat felt too tight to respond. The Blackwood house was unlike anything she had ever seen. A sprawling 2-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide wraparound porch and tall windows that spoke of wealth and permanence. It was beautiful, she had to admit, but it also felt impossibly grand for someone who had grown up in a 2-room cabin. Patrick McKenna helped his wife and daughter down from the wagon, his own discomfort evident in the way he tugged at his collar and smoothed his graying hair. He had worn his only good suit, the one reserved for church and important occasions, and Sarah could see the effort it had cost him to present himself as an equal to Cornelius Blackwood. The front door opened before they could knock, and a middle-aged woman in a crisp black dress appeared. "You must be the McKenna family," she said with a warm smile. "I'm Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper. Mr. Blackwood is waiting for you in the front parlor." They were led through a spacious entryway, adorned with oil paintings of landscapes and cattle, past a formal dining room that could have seated 20 people. to a comfortable sitting room where Cornelius Blackwood rose to greet them. He was even more imposing in person than Sarah had expected, but his manner was cordial as he shook hands with her father and bowed slightly to her mother. "Mrs. McKenna, Mr. McKenna, welcome to our home," he said formally, "and you must be Sarah." His grey eyes studied her with obvious appraisal, and Sarah forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, despite the flush she felt creeping up her neck. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, offering a small curtsy that felt awkward and out of place. "Please sit down. James will be joining us shortly. He's been seeing to some business with the horses, but he knows you're here." As if summoned by his father's words, footsteps could be heard in the hallway, and James Blackwood appeared in the doorway. Sarah's breath caught slightly as she got her first close look at the man who would become her husband. He was taller than she had expected, with dark hair that showed traces of curl despite being neatly combed, and brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. There was something gentle in his expression that surprised her, a thoughtfulness that contrasted with his father's more commanding presence. "I apologize for keeping you waiting," James said, moving into the room with easy confidence. He was dressed in well-tailored clothes that emphasized his height and broad shoulders, but he carried himself without arrogance. "Miss McKenna, it's a pleasure to finally meet you properly." "Mr. Blackwood," Sarah replied, rising slightly from her chair as he approached. When he extended his hand, she hesitated for just a moment before placing her own in it. His grip was warm and firm, calloused from ranch work, despite his obvious prosperity. "Please call me James. We're going to be family soon, after all." The word family sent a strange shiver through Sarah. It was such an ordinary word, but coming from him, it carried the weight of all the changes that lay ahead. She studied his face as he settled into a chair across from her, noting the laugh lines around his eyes and the way he seemed genuinely interested in making her comfortable. "I hope the ride wasn't too difficult," James continued, addressing all three McKennas but keeping his attention primarily on Sarah. "The roads can be rough this time of year." "It was fine," Sarah said, finding her voice. "Your ranch is impressive. I had no idea it was so large." "My father started with nothing more than determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone else," James replied, glancing affectionately at Cornelius. "It's taken 30 years to build what you see today." The conversation continued in this polite, somewhat stilted manner for several minutes, with both sets of parents contributing observations about the weather, the condition of the cattle, and other safe topics. Sarah found herself watching James carefully, trying to gauge what kind of man he really was beneath the courteous exterior. "Perhaps," Cornelius suggested eventually, "James could show Sarah around the property while we discuss some of the practical arrangements for the wedding." Sarah felt her parents' eyes on her, encouraging her to accept, and she nodded. "I'd like that." James stood immediately, offering his arm with old-fashioned gallantry. "The gardens are particularly nice this time of year. My mother planted most of them herself." They walked out onto the wide porch, where Sarah could see the full scope of the ranch spread out before them. Rolling pastures dotted with cattle stretched to the horizon in 3 directions, while the 4th was bounded by the foothills of the Laramie Mountains. It was beautiful in a vast, overwhelming way that made her feel very small. "It must be lonely sometimes," she said without thinking, then immediately regretted the observation as too personal. But James didn't seem offended. "It can be," he admitted, leading her down the porch steps toward a carefully tended flower garden. "Especially since my mother died. She had a way of making even this big house feel warm and welcoming." "I'm sorry for your loss," Sarah said softly. "What was she like?" James paused beside a rose bush heavy with pink blooms, his expression becoming distant. "She was from Boston originally. Educated, cultured, everything my father thought he needed to establish respectability out here. But she was also practical and strong. She could deliver a calf or set a broken bone as easily as she could host a dinner party for the territorial governor. She sounds remarkable." "She was. I hope she would have liked you." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks at the unexpected compliment. "You don't know anything about me yet." "I know you're brave," James said simply. "What you're doing, agreeing to this marriage to protect your family and neighbors, that takes courage." "I respect that." They continued walking in companionable silence, following a path that led around the main house toward the outbuildings. Sarah could see the extensive stables, a large barn, and several smaller structures she couldn't identify. Ranch hands moved about their business, tipping their hats respectfully when they spotted James, but otherwise paying little attention to the couple. "What do you expect from this marriage?" Sarah asked suddenly, stopping beside a wooden fence that enclosed a pasture where several horses grazed peacefully. "I mean, what do you hope it will become?" James turned to face her fully, his brown eyes serious. "I hope we can become friends first and partners in everything that follows. I won't pretend this is a love match. We barely know each other. But I believe two people can build something meaningful together if they're both committed to treating each other with kindness and respect. And if we never come to love each other, if we remain strangers sharing a house, then we'll have failed," James said honestly. "Not just as husband and wife, but as human beings. I don't want a marriage that's just a business arrangement, Sarah. I want us to find happiness together, even if it's different from what we might have chosen under other circumstances." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception or false promises, but found only sincerity. "I don't know how to be a rancher's wife," she admitted. "I don't know how to manage servants or host dinner parties, or any of the things your mother probably did." "You'll learn," James said with a slight smile, "and I'll help you. Besides, I suspect you have strengths my mother never needed. You've survived hardship that she never faced. That kind of resilience will serve you well out here." They had reached the horse pasture, and one of the animals, a beautiful chestnut mare with a white blaze, approached the fence curiously. Sarah reached out tentatively to stroke the horse's nose, surprised when the animal nuzzled her palm gently. "She likes you," James observed. "That's Stella. She was my mother's favorite riding horse. She's been rather standoffish since Mother died, but she seems to sense something good in you." "I've never ridden a horse," Sarah confessed, continuing to pet Stella's velvet nose. "We only had work horses on our farm, and they were too valuable to risk on pleasure riding. Would you like to learn? I could teach you." The offer was made casually, but Sarah heard something deeper in it, a genuine desire to share something he loved with her. "I'd like that," she said, meaning it. They stood there for several minutes, watching the horses and talking quietly about ranch life, farming, and their respective childhoods. Sarah found herself relaxing despite her nervousness, drawn in by James's easy manner and obvious intelligence. He asked thoughtful questions about her family and their struggles, listening to her answers with genuine interest, rather than polite attention. "We should probably head back," James said eventually, glancing toward the house where their parents were presumably still discussing wedding arrangements. "But Sarah, I want you to know if you have any concerns or questions about the marriage, about what your life here will be like, I hope you'll feel free to ask me directly. I know this situation isn't ideal for either of us, but I want you to feel as comfortable as possible with what's ahead." "Thank you," Sarah replied, touched by his consideration. I was afraid you might see me as just a burden, a problem to be managed." "Never," James said firmly. "You're going to be my wife, Sarah. That means you're going to be the most important person in my life. I take that responsibility seriously." As they walked back toward the house, Sarah found herself cautiously optimistic for the first time since this arrangement had been proposed. James Blackwood wasn't the cold, distant man she had feared. He was thoughtful, respectful, and seemed genuinely committed to making their marriage work. It wasn't love, not yet, perhaps not ever, but it was something she could build on. The wedding was still 2 weeks away, but already Sarah was beginning to imagine what her new life might look like. It would be different from anything she had ever known, filled with challenges and responsibilities she could barely comprehend, but maybe, with time and effort, it could also be something good. The sound of hammering echoed across the McKenna homestead as neighbors worked together to build additional seating for the wedding ceremony. Sarah watched from the cabin's doorway as men she had known all her life, Tom Peters, Sean Morrison, old Henrik O'Brien, labored to create something worthy of the occasion that would unite their community with the powerful Blackwood family. "Sarah, come help me with this dress," her mother called from inside. Margaret had been working for days on Sarah's wedding gown, a beautiful creation of cream-colored silk that Cornelius Blackwood had generously provided from his late wife's wardrobe collection. It had required extensive alterations to fit Sarah's smaller frame, but the result was stunning. Sarah turned away from the window reluctantly. The activity outside was a welcome distraction from the nervous energy that had been building inside her for days. The wedding was now only a week away, and while her meetings with James had gone better than expected, she still felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the change approaching her life. "Hold still," Margaret instructed, pinning the hem of the dress with careful precision. "We want this to be perfect. You'll be the most beautiful bride Wyoming Territory has ever seen." "It's not a fairy tale, Mother," Sarah said quietly, though she couldn't help but admire her reflection in the small mirror propped against the wall. The dress transformed her from a simple farm girl into someone who looked like she might actually belong in the grand Blackwood house. "Perhaps not," Margaret replied, sitting back on her heels to examine her work. "But that doesn't mean it can't be the beginning of something wonderful. I've been watching you these past weeks, sweetheart, and I can see changes in you already." "What kind of changes?" "You're standing taller, speaking with more confidence. That young man has been good for you, even in these brief meetings. He treats you like a lady, not just a farmer's daughter." Sarah had to admit her mother was right. Her weekly visits to the Blackwood Ranch had gradually become less formal and more comfortable. James had been patient and kind, showing her around the property, introducing her to the ranch hands and household staff, even beginning to teach her to ride, as he had promised. She was starting to see glimpses of the man behind the courteous exterior, someone who was intelligent and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor and a genuine concern for the people who worked for him. "Mrs. McKenna." "Sarah," the voice of Lucy O'Brien called from outside, accompanied by the sound of approaching horses. "We've brought supplies from town." Sarah carefully lifted the dress over her head, changing back into her everyday clothes, before going outside to greet the visitors. Lucy had ridden over with her fiancé, Tom Peters, their wagon loaded with goods from Laramie, flour, sugar, coffee, and other luxuries that would make the wedding celebration special. "Oh, Sarah," Lucy exclaimed, dismounting gracefully despite her practical riding skirt. "I have news, the most wonderful news." "What is it?" Sarah asked, though Lucy's excitement was infectious enough to lift her own spirits. "Tom and I have decided to have our wedding right after yours. We figured, since everyone will be gathered together anyway, and with the peace treaty between our families and the Blackwoods." Lucy's cheeks were flushed with happiness as she took Sarah's hands in hers. "We can celebrate together. Isn't that perfect?" Sarah felt a genuine smile cross her face for the first time in days. Lucy and Tom had been courting for 2 years, waiting until Tom could save enough money to buy his own small piece of land and build a cabin worthy of a bride. The resolution of the conflict with the Blackwoods would make that possible much sooner than they had hoped. "That's wonderful news," Sarah said, embracing her friend warmly. "I'm so happy for you both." Tom Peters, tall and lanky with sun-bleached hair, grinned broadly as he began unloading the wagon. "Figured it was about time, with all the good fortune that's been coming our way lately. Your marriage is going to change everything for all of us, Sarah. The Blackwoods have already started honoring the water rights agreements, and Cornelius Blackwood promised Tom work breaking horses whenever he needs extra income." "It's like a miracle," Lucy added, her eyes shining. "After all those months of worry and fighting, suddenly everything is working out for everyone." Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was glad for her friend's happiness, truly she was, but it was another reminder of how many people's futures depended on her marriage succeeding. If she and James couldn't make their arrangement work, it wouldn't just affect them, it would impact every family in their small community. That afternoon, as Sarah walked along Willow Creek gathering wildflowers for the cabin, she found herself thinking about the conversation with Lucy and Tom. Their joy was uncomplicated, born from genuine love and shared dreams for the future. Sarah envied them that simplicity, even as she recognized that her own situation, while more complex, might ultimately offer greater security and opportunity. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the approaching horse until a shadow fell across her path. Looking up, she saw James Blackwood dismounting from a beautiful black stallion, his expression concerned. "Sarah, is everything all right? You looked troubled from a distance." "James!" She rose from where she had been kneeling beside the creek, brushing dirt from her skirt. "I didn't expect to see you today. I was riding the boundary lines and saw you here. I hope you don't mind the intrusion." He secured his horse's reins to a nearby tree and walked toward her, his boots crunching softly on the dried grass. "You seemed upset about something." Sarah hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Lucy O'Brien and Tom Peters are getting married right after our wedding. They're so happy, so excited about their future together. It made me realize how different our situation is." James was quiet for a moment, studying her face with those thoughtful brown eyes. "Are you having doubts? About the marriage, I mean." "Not doubts exactly. More like Questions about whether we're doing the right thing, whether it's fair to either of us to enter into marriage without love. Come, sit with me, James said, gesturing toward a fallen log that made a natural bench beside the creek. I've been thinking about the same thing. They sat side by side, close enough that Sarah could smell the leather and sage scent of his clothes, far enough apart to maintain propriety. The creek burbled softly beside them, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark was singing. I watched my parents together for 25 years, James said eventually. They had something special, a partnership that went beyond just running the ranch together. They genuinely enjoyed each other's company, supported each other through difficulties, celebrated each other's successes. I always assumed I'd find something similar when I married. And now? Sarah asked softly. Now I'm wondering if that kind of connection has to exist from the beginning, or if it can be built over time between two people who are committed to each other's happiness. He turned to look at her directly. I'm attracted to you, Sarah. Not just physically, though you're beautiful. I'm drawn to your strength, your intelligence, the way you care so deeply about your family and community. That seems like a foundation we could build on. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks at his frank words. I've been trying to imagine what our life together will be like. The daily routines, the conversations over breakfast, the way we'll make decisions together. It feels so uncertain. Most of life is uncertain, James replied. Even Lucy and Tom, as much as they love each other now, don't know what challenges they'll face or how they'll change over the years. At least we're going into this with realistic expectations and a commitment to making it work. Is that enough, do you think? Commitment and realistic expectations. James picked up a smooth stone from the creek bank, turning it over in his hands as he considered the question. My mother once told me that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day. You choose to put someone else's happiness alongside your own, to build something together, instead of pursuing only your individual desires. Maybe we're just starting with the choice and hoping the feeling will follow. Sarah watched the water flow past them, carrying leaves and small branches downstream toward some distant destination. What if it doesn't? What if we remain polite strangers for the rest of our lives? Then we'll have wasted an opportunity for happiness, James said simply. But I don't think that will happen. I think you're too vibrant, and I'm too curious about you for us to remain strangers for long. There was something in his voice that made Sarah look at him more closely. His expression was serious, but there was warmth there too, and something that might have been hope. I should probably get back, she said reluctantly, gathering up the wildflowers she had picked. Mother will be wondering where I am. Of course. James stood and offered his hand to help her up, and Sarah felt that same jolt of awareness she had experienced during their first meeting. There was definitely attraction between them, she realized, something that might indeed provide the foundation he had spoken of. Sarah, he said as they walked toward his horse, I want you to know that whatever happens between us, I'll never make you regret this choice. I can't promise you'll be happy every day, but I can promise you'll be respected and cared for. You'll have a true partner, not just a husband in name only. Thank you, she replied, meaning it. That means more to me than you might realize. As James mounted his horse and rode away, Sarah stood watching until he disappeared over the rise. 1 week from today, she would become Mrs. James Blackwood. The thought no longer filled her with quite the same dread it had just a few weeks ago. Instead, she felt something that might have been anticipation, not for the wedding itself, perhaps, but for the life that would begin afterward. Walking back toward the cabin, wildflowers in hand, Sarah found herself humming the same song the meadowlark had been singing. For the first time since this arrangement had been proposed, she was genuinely curious about her future, rather than simply resigned to it. The morning of Sarah's wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline Wyoming sky that seemed to promise good fortune. She woke before sunrise in the small cabin that had been her home for 19 years, listening to the familiar sounds of her mother moving quietly in the kitchen, preparing what would be their last breakfast together as an unmarried family. Outside, she could hear the voices of neighbors who had arrived early to help with final preparations. The women would be arranging flowers and setting up tables, while the men finished constructing the wooden arch where she and James would exchange vows. The entire community had come together for this day, understanding that it represented not just a marriage, but the beginning of a new era of peace and prosperity for all of them. Sarah, darling, it's time to get ready, Margaret called softly from the doorway. Her mother's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her smile was genuine as she carried in a tray with tea and toast. Mrs. Hartwell sent over some special soap from the Blackwood house. Lavender, she said, from Mrs. Eleanor's own garden. Sarah sat up in bed, accepting the cup of tea gratefully. Her stomach was too nervous for food, but the warm liquid helped steady her nerves. Through the small window, she could see wagons arriving. Families from miles around coming to witness the union that would change everything. An hour later, Sarah stood in her mother's bedroom, while Margaret, Lucy O'Brien, and Mrs. Morrison helped her into the altered wedding dress. The cream silk fell in elegant folds around her feet, and the delicate lace at the neckline framed her face beautifully. Margaret had fashioned a simple veil from fine cotton, secured with wildflowers that matched the bouquet Sarah would carry. "Oh, Sarah," Lucy breathed, stepping back to admire the transformation. "You look like a princess from one of those storybooks." "I feel like I'm pretending to be someone else," Sarah admitted, studying her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was elegant and composed, bearing little resemblance to the farm girl who had worn patched dresses and braided her own hair just weeks ago. "You're not pretending," Margaret said firmly, adjusting the veil one final time. "You're becoming. This is who you were always meant to be, sweetheart. You just needed the right circumstances to let her emerge." A knock at the door interrupted them, and Patrick's voice called out, "The groom's party is arriving." "It's time, ladies." Sarah's heart began beating faster as she heard the sound of multiple horses and a carriage approaching the cabin. Through the window, she could see James dismounting from his black stallion, dressed in a formal black suit that emphasized his height and broad shoulders. Behind him came Cornelius Blackwood, the local minister, and several ranch hands who would serve as witnesses. "Take a deep breath," Margaret instructed, squeezing Sarah's hands gently. "Remember, this young man cares about you. He's proven that these past weeks. Trust in that and trust in yourself." The ceremony itself passed in something of a blur for Sarah. She remembered walking out of the cabin on her father's arm, seeing the faces of everyone she had known since childhood turned toward her with expressions of hope and joy. She remembered James's face as she approached, the way his eyes widened slightly when he saw her in the wedding dress, the small smile that played at the corners of his mouth. The minister's words seemed to echo from a great distance. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of James William Blackwood and Sarah Catherine McKenna in holy matrimony." But James's voice when he spoke his vows was clear and strong. "I, James, take you, Sarah, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When it came her turn, Sarah's voice was steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I, Sarah, take you, James, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." The ring James slipped onto her finger was a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, warm from his pocket and somehow comforting in its solid reality. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, James's kiss was gentle and brief, but there was something in it that promised deeper intimacy to come. The celebration that followed was unlike anything their small community had ever seen. The Blackwoods had provided beef from their own herds, and the tables groaned under the weight of dishes prepared by every family for miles around. There was music and dancing, speeches and toasts, and an atmosphere of general joy that made Sarah feel for the first time that this marriage might truly be the blessing everyone claimed it was. "Mrs. Blackwood," James said, appearing at her elbow as she watched Tom Peters and Lucy O'Brien exchange their own vows in a smaller ceremony beside the creek. "How does it feel to hear your new name?" "Strange," Sarah admitted, turning to smile at him, "but not unpleasant. Mrs. Blackwood sounds like someone important, someone who matters." "You are important," James said seriously, "and you've always mattered. The name just makes it official." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself relaxing into the role of bride, accepting congratulations and well wishes with growing confidence. The community's joy was infectious, and she began to understand that this marriage was seen not as a sacrifice she was making, but as a triumph she had achieved. When the sun began to set, James appeared at her side again, this time with a practical purpose. "It's time for us to leave for the ranch," he said quietly. "Mrs. Hartwell has prepared the master bedroom for you, and she's laid out some clothes that should fit until we can arrange for a proper wardrobe." The reality of what came next hit Sarah suddenly and forcefully. She would be leaving her family home, perhaps forever, to begin a new life with a man she had known for less than a month. They would be expected to share not just a house but a bed, to begin the intimate relationship that was part of their marriage contract. "I need to say goodbye to my parents," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. The farewells were tearful but brief. Patrick hugged her tightly, whispering, "Be happy, daughter. That's all we've ever wanted for you." Margaret pressed a small bundle into her hands, letters and mementos from home to help her remember where she came from during the adjustment to her new life. The ride to the Blackwood Ranch in James's carriage was quiet, both of them seemingly lost in thought as they traveled the familiar road that now led to Sarah's new home. As they approached the house, Sarah could see lights in the windows and smoke rising from several chimneys, signs of the warm, welcoming home James had promised to provide. "Sarah," James said as they drew up in front of the house, "I want you to know that there's no pressure about tonight or any night. We'll take things at whatever pace feels right to both of us. This is your home now, and I want you to feel safe and comfortable here." Mrs. Hartwell was waiting to greet them, her face wreathed in smiles as she ushered Sarah inside and up to the master bedroom. The room was larger than the entire McKenna cabin, with a massive four-poster bed, elegant furniture, and windows that looked out over the ranch's main courtyard. Fresh flowers had been placed on the dresser, and a fire crackled welcomingly in the fireplace. "Mr. James thought you might like some time to settle in," Mrs. Hartwell explained, showing Sarah where nightgowns and robes had been laid out. "He's in his study attending to some business, but he asked me to tell you that, when you're ready, he'd like to show you the rest of the house properly." Left alone, Sarah changed out of her wedding dress and into a simple day dress, then stood at the window looking out at her new domain. The ranch stretched away in all directions, vast and overwhelming, but also beautiful in its own way. Somewhere out there, cattle grazed peacefully, horses ran free in the pastures, and ranch hands were settling in for the night, secure in their employment and the stability the Blackwood name provided. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, turning to see James enter the room. He had changed out of his formal suit into more casual clothes, and his hair was slightly mussed, as if he had been running his fingers through it. "How are you feeling?" he asked, staying near the doorway as if unsure of his welcome. "Overwhelmed," Sarah answered honestly, "but hopeful, I think. It's been quite a day." "It has indeed." James moved closer, stopping a few feet away from her. "Sarah, I meant what I said earlier about taking things slowly. I know this is all very new and strange for you." "For both of us," Sarah corrected gently. "You've never been married either." "True enough." James smiled, and some of the tension seemed to leave his shoulders. "Perhaps we can figure it out together." They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, the enormity of their situation settling around them like a warm blanket. They were married now, bound together by law and community expectation, but also by their own growing respect and affection for each other. "James," Sarah said finally, "I want you to know that I'm committed to making this marriage work, not just for our families or the community, but for us. I think we could be happy together if we're both willing to try." "I'd like that very much," James replied, stepping closer and taking her hands in his. "Mrs. Sarah Blackwood, I think this might be the beginning of something very good indeed." As if to seal the promise, he leaned down and kissed her again, longer this time, with more warmth and intention. Sarah found herself responding, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they broke apart, both were breathing a little faster, and Sarah could see something new in James's eyes, not just respect and kindness, but genuine desire and affection. "Tomorrow," James said softly, "I'll start teaching you everything you need to know about running this ranch. You'll meet all the hands properly, learn about the cattle and the horses, begin to understand how everything works together." "And tonight?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "Tonight," James replied, his voice growing deeper, "we begin learning about each other." 6 months later, Sarah Blackwood stood on the front porch of her home, watching the sun rise over the Wyoming landscape that had become as familiar and dear to her as her childhood farm had ever been. Her hand rested unconsciously on the slight curve of her belly, where the first Blackwood air was already making his or her presence known. James emerged from the house behind her, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the contented expression that had become his habitual look. since their marriage had evolved from a business arrangement into something much deeper and more meaningful. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, handing her a cup and slipping his arm around her waist. "Sleep well?" "Very well, thank you, Mr. Blackwood," Sarah replied, leaning into his warmth and marveling, as she did every morning, at how natural this felt. The formal politeness was a game they played now, a gentle joke that acknowledged how far they had traveled from those first awkward meetings. In the distance, they could see Tom Peters and Lucy working on their own small ranch, their love story continuing alongside the larger tale of peace and prosperity that had settled over their corner of Wyoming territory. The McKenna farm was thriving under Blackwood protection, and Sarah's parents had become frequent and welcome visitors to their daughter's grand new home. "Any regrets?" James asked quietly, a question he had posed regularly in the early months of their marriage. "None," Sarah answered, and meant it completely. "You?" "Only that it took a land dispute to bring us together," James replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I can't imagine my life without you now." As they stood together watching their world wake up around them, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a sacrifice had become a gift, not just the material comfort and security she now enjoyed, but the deep partnership and growing love she shared with the man beside her. The arranged marriage that was supposed to end a conflict had indeed brought peace to their community. But more than that, it had brought two people together who might never have found each other otherwise, creating something beautiful and lasting from the most unlikely of beginnings. Sarah smiled as she felt the baby kick gently, a reminder of the future they were building together. In a few months, there would be a new generation of Blackwoods to carry on the legacy James's father had built, and she was helping to shape. The thought filled her with a contentment she had never imagined possible on that frightening day when her parents had first proposed this arrangement. Sometimes Sarah thought as she sipped her coffee and watched the sun climb higher into the vast Wyoming sky. The best things in life came from having the courage to embrace change, even when you couldn't see where it would lead. She had trusted in the possibility of happiness, and happiness had found her in return. The Truce bride had become something she had never expected to be, a truly beloved wife, and soon, a mother. It was, she thought with deep satisfaction, exactly the life she was meant to live.